Cultural Center in Venice, Italy. I'm speaking today from Palazzo Michele, which is one of ECC venues in Venice. This year, we present the 5th edition of Time Space Existence, which is an extensive architecture biennial exhibition that takes place every 2 years in Venice during the Architecture Biennale. The title of this year Biennale is How We Will Live Together. And we have the pleasure today to present 8 books, an event that brings together architects from different parts of the world. And like our exhibition is a moment to share and with the public what is happening around the world. So it's a pleasure to give the stage to Chi, the moderator of this presentation. I thank you very much, all of you, to be with us today.
Thank you, Raquel. And for those of you who are in Venice, it's a pleasure for all of us to think of you out there enjoying the Giardini and probably getting ready to meander over for a cocktail while we're here. I'm sorry to say most of us on this panel are in our home offices and drinking our morning coffee and getting ready to head to work. So please enjoy an Aperol Spritz for all of us. And as Raquel said, I'm Chi Perlman. I'm the curator of arts and design for the TED conference. And I'm delighted to join you as host of 8 Books, which is a conversation that was the brainchild and curated by Mitchell McKean more than 2 years ago. And we all know what happened to intervene in 2020. The curator of this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, Hashim Sarkis, has posited a disarmingly simple and I find deeply provocative question with the theme of this year's Biennale. How will we all live together? Exactly. How will we all live on this planet together in such a polarizing time and with such acute and growing inequity, and of course, the ever more perilous threats to our planet? The question is more urgent than ever. And I have to find I find it really sometimes depressing. And I was talking to a climate scientist recently, and after hearing the litany of stats, I asked her the question, and her answer was refreshing and in a way obvious. And what she said was, what we need are leaders in every sector, and that will be the only way that we win. So I feel fortunate today and encouraged that we have an impressive roster of authors who bring ideas from different lenses to the urgency of all of us living together. All of our contributors today have a strong agenda of sustainability and issues of climate dynamics, and they all point the way for leadership in architecture and the built environment. So let's get to our 8 authors and a rapid fire tour of 8 important books. I will just say as a note that you are able to upload your questions, and we do hope that we'll have time for them at the end of the panel. So go ahead and submit those questions as we go along, and we'll leave some time for conversation at the end. So rapid fire, as I said, we will start with the author Peter Anker, who is a historian of science, ecology, and design, and an associate professor at NYU. He'll be presenting his book, The Power of the Periphery, How Norway Became an Environmental Pioneer for the World. Next, we'll have Aran Chan. He is the founding principal and executive director of ODA, and he's the author of Unboxing New York, which is a behind-the-scenes examination of the changing shape of New York and a sort of roadmap to creativity in the highly regulated metropolis that many of us live in. Kai Bergman, who is a partner with Bjarke Engels at Big Architects, will present Form Giving, which is a book on our architectural future. It looks at the horizon of time or giving form to the future, which Kai and Bjarke are very obsessed with in terms of humans' impact on the planet. That will be followed by Julia Watson, who is a designer, an activist, an academic, and author, and a leader in the field of low tech, which is defined as nature-based technologies for the built environment and climate resilient design. Following Julia, Michael Murphy of Mass Design Group. Michael is the founding partner and principal of Mass. It's an interdisciplinary architecture and design collective. And as a writer, teacher, designer, architect, his work investigates the social and political consequences of our built world. And he will be speaking about his recent book, Justice is Beauty. We will then welcome Nina Edwards-Anker, who is an architect, interior designer, and founder of NEA Studio, and whose work has long revolved around sustainable design. Nina will speak to her book, Cocoon House, which is a case study in domestic sustainability. That will be followed by Paul Miller. Paul Miller is always introduced as AKA DJ Spooky, and he is a polymath, composer, multimedia artist, writer, and his work immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. He'll be speaking about his forthcoming book. We'll get a sneak preview called Digital Fictions, which focuses on the future of storytelling. And then finally, Mitch, Maria, and Nurham, all representing of Terraform One, will speak to a very important book called Design with Life, Biotech, Architecture, and Resilient Cities. And this book, I have had a chance to look at it, and it's a chronicle of breakthroughs and projects that are defining the new directions in socio-ecological design. So let's get right to this, and I will turn the mic over to you, Peter. And if you would unmute, that would be lovely.
Thank you so much, Xi, and thank you, everyone. I'm so happy that soul and body is divided, because my soul right now is in Venice, though my body is in New York. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about what's happening in Norway and my own book. If you allow me to share screen, I will do that right now. All right, so we are right now in the very, very north of Europe. This is Norway and the Spittsburgh Archipelago, with the famous seed bank in which Norway, as a small nation in the world, would store all the seeds from all over the world, being the sort of the world protector of biodiversity. This is a very typical kind of Norwegian way of thinking about themselves as the world protector. This is my book. You don't have to buy it. It's actually for free. You just type in the title and my name, and you'll get to a site where you can download it for free, open access. How is that, Venice? So here's the place up in the Arctic with the seed bank, and then Norway as the protector. If you Google Norway, this is what the images that comes up. You see beautiful small cottages in beautiful pristine nature. This is a carefully created a view of Norway, which does not at all reflect reality. But you see how, to the question, how do we live together now? In Norway, people live a dual life. One life is their real life in the city, if you like, in where they do the actual work. And then they have this imaginary life out in the countryside with small little cottages. And these small little cottages and this small little place out in the buoy kind of defines the way the city is, or the central life is envisioned. So the small place in the periphery, and that's why I call the book The Power Periphery, defines the way people imagine the center. Though when Norwegians go abroad, they will define the whole Norway as the periphery, and thus as an example to admire for the world. Little history of science, because that's my profession. This is up at Finse, which is right up in the mountains of Norway. This is where ecology as a science was born in 1965 in Norway. A small little romantic, beautiful little cottage. And this is where, the avant-garde researchers will come together and define ecology as kind of a harmonious, beautiful science of interrelationship between nature. It soon evolved into the biggest ecological research station in Europe, maybe the world, I don't know, by 1972, in which this view from the periphery, the view from the mountain, the way of organizing nature and thinking about nature as pristine, as untouched, as a place for vacation, as a place to enjoy, was kind of created. This is where everyone who needed to be something in the radical world of Norway in the early 70s would go. This is the epicenter of counterculture, of hippies, of reimagining the world. What happened up here in Norway, including eco-philosophy, eco-theology, eco-politics, and the rest of it. This is where it's happening. This is where it's the powerhouse of reimagining Norway. Here we see a bunch of the ecologists up there in the same place. We see the research station down in the center, in which they would frame the way we would think about the natural world, not only for Norway, but also for the world, as many of these thinkers became hugely influential. My book kind of tracks that. Words like sustainability comes from Norway, sustainable development is from Norway, eco-philosophy, deep ecology, eco-theology, and eco-politics. All these words come out of the Norwegian debate, and they're situated in this type of environment, and they juxtapose the center. So this is out in the vacation land, if you like, and is seen as a contrast to the center. This you can see from this display. This is created by the architecture school in Oslo, a famous exhibition called "And After Us" in Norwegian, og etter oss. And you here see a typical dualism for the Cold War. On the left, you see how it is today, since the top i dag, and you see how the resources are being put into factories, then creates product, then consumed by the consumer, and then turned into garbage. Interestingly, right now I'm sitting right where the toilet is. So in New York City, right? And literally that building is where I live. And then Imagine Tomorrow, and that's to the right, where everything is then recirculated. And as you see, it's not going back to garbage; it's going back into nature, and therefore creating this harmonious system. Again, this reflects the mountain, the vacation, and also the periphery of the environment. You see here cows in the center, in the bottom, and sort of a pastoral life as an alternative to city life. So this is the way, the contrast of the Cold War, but also contrast of environmental debates in Norway. Important, actually absolutely key important to understand how environmental debates have been framed and how we live together in Norway in this dual life of the city and the periphery. And how, when Norwegians go abroad, immediately point to the images on the right as Norway as the example, everything good, and then ignore all the things on the left, which is oil production, pollution, all kind of mining. Norway is not an environmentally friendly country, even though, as you saw on the Google images of Norway, the image on the right is what appears. Famous demonstrations happened. This is a Sigmund Kvale in Mardøla in 1970, one of the biggest environmental demonstrations in Norway. To the right, you see again the waterfall and picturesque landscape. Here you see Arne Næss, the famous philosopher, who was in the midst of this, also celebrating the periphery and his deep ecology and eco-philosophy being framed in this way. There was some local resistance. Hippies go home if you have one. I just put that in. This is the moment of roaring laughter. Anyway, they would travel to the periphery to get inspired. They will find it in Nepal. This is as remote as you can get, sort of a Shangri-La place, according to today, where everything was living in ecological harmony. This place in the complete remote of Nepal will be the place of admiration for what the world should admire and get inspired from. These are the people living in ecological harmony. Here are some images from the trip there. And of course, this had to do actually with reimagining Norwegian life in the periphery. This is an old traditional mountain farm in Norway. You may say picturesque and beautiful, but it actually is quite hard life to make a living in these type of places. But Norwegian ecologists, environmentalists, they would see this as the future, of hope. This is another case of the periphery. This is Arne cabin called Nirvana up in a mountain, literally on top of a mountain. And in this chair, he would sit and think out the principles of deep ecology. You can say you have that sort of Weltanschauung in which the cabin signals the Puritan sort of way of living, if you like, in contact with nature. Yet it's paradox that in a very kind of mountain top, you get the sort of overview over nature. Again, you get the sort of Cold War. What do we imagine the future to be like? Either it's the green to the left or it's the hydropower to the right. These were the major conflicts of the 70s and 80s, which will frame environmental thinking in Norway and beyond. And you find that expressions like deep and shallow ecology, sustainable, unsustainable, etc. Heavy demonstrations. Here are the Norwegian Prime Minister, and this would frame our common future. I'll get to the architecture. This is the typical Norwegian cabin up the mountain. This is the indigenous architecture, the Sami to the left, the indigenous Norwegian to the right. And this would be the typical way of dreaming a different future for Norwegian architects. Here's Jensen Skolbin's summer house up in the mountains. So if you're an architect in Norway, it's all about creating that amazing cabin that will create your fame. This is where you can play.
Can you... Sorry.
Yeah.
As promised, we have many speakers to come. Can you wrap up in the next 10 seconds?
We are done. I just want to show you these beautiful images and boom, done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So sorry to have to step on you.
No problem. Don't be sorry.
No worries. Let's keep moving. Aran, you're up next.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to take you from the gorgeous landscapes of Norway to the concrete forest of New York City. I'm in transit, sitting in New York City, so I'll be brief, and I'm not going to share images, but I'm delighted to be with a group of my colleagues that I also admire to talk about how we can live better together. And perhaps maybe as a contrast to the beautiful landscape of Norway, if we find a way to live better together in a densified city, we might have the utopian option to release more of our planet to Mother Nature and allow a better balance between the two. So to that end, I just want to talk about the way that I see architecture moving, which is sort of described in our book, Unboxing New York. Came through Actor in 2020, where we talk a little bit about architecture is moving from formalism to kind of environmentalism. And in that sense, not that we as architects and designers are done giving form, but the motivation behind our form making has changed. And to that end, I want to say that we perhaps look differently as a culture at what we consider meaningful and beautiful. While we recognize sort of our superiority as humans, we also acknowledge our fragility, which is a beautiful thing, and thank God we do. And maybe people become a bit more vulnerable. And I want to say that our vulnerability and our fragility is not only in light of climate change and environmental disasters that are monumental, not only because of virus that catches us, so fragile, but also through our social fabric of how vulnerable that is become, social injustice and our desire to create more equitable city. So each one of my friends here, I believe in their book is touching different aspects of fragility and vulnerability of humanity. But I think we all believe that through architecture and innovation and ingenuity, we can change the platform that would allow us to live better together. So outside ODA, we're interested in what we call the Fractal City. And to oversimplify that idea, it's about creating moments of human intimacy across different scales in our city. It sounds obvious, but as we know, our city has, many of our cities through densification have lost the transitions of intimate or ability to create intimacy with one another and with our surrounding. And in our book, we kind of lay out in almost a very ultra pragmatic way 5 chapters by which we talk about the realities of our city, New York City in 2020, and how by kind of mastering each one of them, we perhaps can make small changes to deal with monumental problems. Asking questions like, can we bring qualities of suburbia housing into multifamily buildings? Can we maintain our privacy while creating connectivity with our neighbors? Can we improve the public realm through expanding of the sidewalks, and to what degree that would make more equitable city, et cetera? So Unboxing New York is sort of behind the scene of our firm in our first 10 years of existence. It's more of a diary than anything else, but it does give a glance to the realities that many of us are facing in large cities today, and perhaps propose some sort of an utopian vision that if we can fulfill a better ability to live with one another in density through restructuring and rethinking the old formulas of buildings and urbanism, then we can retrieve from more areas on our planet, bring them back to nature, and perhaps restore some of the things we lost. And I'm sure that my friends are going to talk about that more than I in the continuation. So with that, I would end and hand it over back to you, Chief.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and I think that weaves together with some of the other points that we're going to hear on this panel. I'll keep us moving. Kai, over to you.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Peter and Aaron. I will just share my screen, and please tell me if you see it. So in order to actually understand form giving, you really have to sort of also see it is as a kind of part of yes is more, hot to cold, and form giving, all of which actually began with exhibitions of sort of looking back with the intent of sort of seeing certain themes and certain sort of directives and goals that we wanted to sort of achieve as an office. And it's also very much Bjarke, his words, and kind of forming both in Yes is More sort of optimism, approaching the field with all of its kind of you can't do this and regulations and NIMBYism, and looking for a path within architecture that would look for ways of actually moving forward in a sort of positive momentum. And then hot to cold, actually looking back at how that path was then constructed. And as we moved into working more globally, how climate and where a project is actually located impacts the decisions that one makes, which is now then into form giving. The other thread here is Taschen as a publisher really is an incredible relationship that we've established, and that is able sort of, when you think of it as it was an exhibition that was actually at the Danish Architecture Museum of about 35 of our projects, and Yes, it's More. And we self-published a book. We had no idea to kind of how does one distribute that book, that catalog, which is a depiction of the exhibition. We actually went to a store that was just opening in Copenhagen, the Taschen bookstore, and we kind of guerrilla-like placed our book self-published onto the shelves of the book, and Benedict was just there for the opening of the shop, and thought that guerrilla action was kind of unique. So he took a copy that was on the shelf and took it home with him, and then later we didn't realize, but he had actually started off selling comic books in Cologne, Germany. And it was that fascination of the sort of Arctic comic that he actually then asked if he could then publish and become the publishing house with which we sort of self-published the Yes is More book. That relationship with Taschen then extended into Hot to Cold, which again started with an exhibition and looking at 60 of our projects. And here at the National Building Museum, again, looking at how climate and site and the sort of, moving from the coldest climates to the hottest climates actually started to drive certain decisions in the work. And so that tour of about 40 different countries in which the work was made, and the sort of mapping of the climactic data into the book was very, very important. And that really then culminates in the latest sort of exhibition, which was at the Danish Architecture Museum, where again we looked at a little bit of the playfulness that Legos in the Danish context allow for an immense creative sort of thought process. And so Lego builders had actually built and reimagined our designs here, the Aarhus residential project, with Legos, and really inspired kids to think about how they would like to form their futures. And it is this timeline of evolution and innovation that looked at from the beginning of time, the Big Bang, until today, where in what fields one sort of innovates. And that kind of culminates then with a William Gibson quote: "The future is already here, all around us. It's just not evenly distributed." And maybe as designers, we begin to match and find those threads. And this then sort of culminated in a room that was filled with those common threads, and how we view each project as kind of a little step that together could actually kind of create a bigger leap as we move into thinking about both how we live, but also how we inhabit the ecology that we are given. So the book started off as, I think, many books in sort of different forms, different ideas, and then is refined. And I think that, when you look at sort of Bjarke's notes, Bjarke's kind of thinking and sort of what to include in both the exhibition and the book, it becomes really interesting that there's this sort of emphasis on the past, which is looking at sort of 6 filters with which to view all of that innovation: making, sensing, sustaining, thinking, healing, moving, seeing how migration patterns start to impact, seeing how AI in the future will also start to shape the way that we are actually thinking about our work. Then in the present, looking at the work that we actually are doing and that is on the boards, and then the future, sort of looking at future planetary movement, both looking in terms of the moon and the Mars, but whatever we do in order to perhaps reach and habitate those planets, we can actually learn and bring that knowledge back into Earth and creating a more circular sort of lifestyle here on this planet. So all of this work is, of course, the product of the entire sort of bigster brain that is daily kind of conversing and working on these projects. A lot of thought also, or I'd say a teaser of Master Planet and how that works together. And then on the sort of how we live, there's really this idea of how can we look at the smallest scale, 17 square meters, a cabin in upper New York State that is completely sort of off grid, offering a chance to sort of see and view what is the sort of minimal footprint that we could have or need in order to sort of survive. And then moving in the book also to different scales and looking at how we can provide perhaps other ideas that work with resiliency and here is a floating sort of dormitory in Copenhagen, looking at how we can upcycle containers and allow them to suddenly be a way of taking brownfields and turning them into sort of social green fields in places that people actually would like to live and work right in the center of our cities. So, and then that also expands to bigger themes of looking at climate refugees and how one could start to thinking of floating or amphibious architecture, and then finally moving to space and looking at how we could actually start to both inhabit but also build and construct here with 3D printing, using the moon regolith to sort of build out that future habitat. So that is a project that we're working right now with NASA to sort of think about that future and how, again, those innovations and that type of circular thinking there could really start to impact and be useful here on this planet.
Great. Thank you, Kai. I love that story about your guerrilla subversive planting of your book. Natasha. Let us shift gears a bit. We will go over to Julia Watson. And Julia, I think you have a story to tell us that may go in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, thank you, Chi. I'm just going to share screen here. So I actually want to reframe the question slightly. But first I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, the Lenape people, both past and present, and honor with gratitude both the land and the Lenape people. And so the question of how we will live together in the context of my book, Low Tech, I think is worthy of being reframed, and an alternative question posed, which is how do we live together? But the we of the question that I'm asking is not the European American we that we often talk about, but a collective we. And the we, that's a we that is really inclusive of all the thousands of cultures that exist on the earth today, and it includes their knowledge, their technologies, and their mythological understandings of how we can live together collaboratively, but also symbiotically with nature. And so one example in the book is the Khasi people of Northeast India, who live in the wettest place on earth. And their mythology, or their origin story, tells of a time when 10 families came down from the sky on a ladder that was grown from a tree. And so in honor of that ladder and this mythology, they have a technology that's made out of a fig tree, which is the Ficus elastica, which is actually a tree that is sacred to them. And so the tree is not just coincidentally sacred to these people, it's the same tree that the Khasi used to build this incredible living bridge technology. And it's trained over generations collaboratively to grow over the rivers. And they're in fact the only bridges that can withstand this incredible force of the monsoonal rains that pass through this area that's the wettest place on earth. And this technology allows the Khasi to live together when they would be actually separated because they can't travel between the villages during the wettest times of the year. And they take generations to grow, which means that the first person who plants the trees on either side of the river, they may actually never use these bridges in their lifetime. They're just initiating the first stages of construction. And then after that, the next generation will train those routes across the bridge. And the generation after that will actually be the generation that uses this bridge. And so these living root bridges and living root ladders are technologies that are incredibly well adapted to their environments, and they play a really key role in conserving forest biodiversity, allowing for many different species, human and non-human, to live together. And so this book is really all about technologies, but it's all about mythology as well. And this word myth, it's a really interesting word. It's taken from the ancient Greek mythos, and it means the story of the people, and it's guided mankind for millennia. And so the mythology of low tech is actually one of collaboration, and it speaks to the collective working together towards this common goal. And this is the mythology that's embedded in the technology of Indigenous innovation. It's about working symbiotically with nature, sharing resources, thinking multi-generationally, and using mythology and culture as a means to capture climate resilient thinking, which is conceived as really essential for human survival. And it lies really in stark contrast to the dominant Western mythology of technology, which really emerged from industrialization and the feasting of the felling of forests and the extraction of resources that distanced us from nature, and it really favored fuel by fire. And this is the legacy that haunts us today. So these are the types of technologies that are in my book, Low Tech. If you're not familiar with the word low tech, it's because I made it up. It's a combination of two words, local and TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge. And it's intentionally named that as a provocation to really expose our biases towards local cultures, their technologies, and their communities and their relationships to nature, which we have. And we often think of these technologies as low tech, TECH, and cast them in this light of unsophisticated and primitive when they're actually incredibly sophisticated and sustainable. And they embody all of today's sustainability principles like low cost, low embodied energy, forming closed loop systems. And so TEK, which is the other part of the title, is traditional ecological knowledge, and it's the cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And this whole concept is nested, it can be conceived as a system of nested concepts, beginning with the individual's understanding of their local knowledge and of their land and their animals, sitting within their resource management, how they sort of relate to their environments, how they're symbiotic with nature. Then it sits within their social institutions, the collective we, how they live together and how you can take advantage of those, the we, and the relationships that are composed of that. And then underneath that is the worldview or the belief system. And so Low Tech was really, it's a book, but it was also conceived as a movement to rebuild our understanding of local knowledge, reconceive of what technology is, and relate it to vernacular design to generate this idea for the potential of expanding our understanding of sustainable climate resilient infrastructures. And I wanted to show a quick example, which was the Berry wastewater aquaculture system in India. And so in parts of the world where rivers are often really heavily contaminated with sewage, there's an Indian city that has 15 million people in it that use its floodplains to clean its wastewater. And it does this through this incredible combination of sunshine and sewage and a symbiosis between algae and bacteria. And it breaks the wastewater down, and it does this through a system of fish ponds, and it takes 30 days. And it started 120 years ago. And not only does it clean the city's water, it also produces the city's food. And it sits on the outskirts of this huge city, and it's sort of surrounded by, it's ribboned by the ribbon of highways. It's next to the city's smoking escarpment of trash, and it actually sort of has expanded in the last 40 years as the population of Calcutta has expanded 400%. So it's really adapting to the changes within the city to accommodate those changes. And it's not just an innovation for chemical and coal power free purification. It also provides 100,000 jobs for the city. And Calcutta has no formal treatment system, so it's the only way the water can be cleaned before entering the Bay of Bengal. And so at this moment, we can either continue on this narrow view of technology, or we can think about, what are the other ways that we can live with nature and with each other collaboratively, and to enhance, our relationships with nature, and rethink about what's the idea of infrastructures, what's already out there, and how can we really look at the past to rethink the future. And so with the technology of Calcutta, this was technologies that they have multiple functions. They clean wastewater, they irrigate crops, they do many things. And so it's not just a singular function, it creates a lot more value for the city in response to, and can assist us with thinking about new technologies to deal with climate crisis. This is another city It's on the outskirts of, it's in Benin, West Africa. It's a city that sits within a lake system, and it feeds 1 million people in the lake that live on the periphery of the lake through this system of an artificial reef created for aquaculture. And it's really trying to rethink how humans can live in these extreme environments and create technologies that supports human survival. So really, with our fascination with the future, we often forget to look to the past, and low-tech is this movement seeding creativity in crisis that really is inspired by technologies born from climate extremes. And I really want to sort of underpin that low-tech is really asking us to rethink of technology. It's not about going backwards. We can't go backwards to fix all the problems and the causes of climate change, but we can go forward, rethinking and rebuilding in a way that supports the resilience of communities, of cities, and removes that distance from nature and addresses the social inequalities that our current systems support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. It's hard to cut you off. For those of you who would like to see more of Julia's research and her findings, I'm thrilled to tell you she has a beautiful talk on TED.com, so you can go to see her TED Talk and watch much more about her ideas and in depth in Indigenous thinking. And we will keep moving, unfortunately, quickly. And I will turn the mic over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Chi. Thanks, Julia. It was great to see all of that and inspired to be here with all of you. I wanted to, I'm going to talk about our book, and hopefully it fits in with this larger conversation. I'm sure, like many of you, we began seeking to make a sort of anti-monograph. I'm sure that's the starting point of many architectural projects. Trying to attempt to include everything we haven't built, show the connections between the loose threads and completed work, and really document a fuller breadth than is often covered, to try to communicate core ideas of the work that we've been trying to do over the last decade. But in the end, when we simplified everything down to the core elements, we really had something much closer to a monograph than different than one, and that was more about the journey that we've gone on over the course of the last decade. In its most simple elemental form, we wanted our book to resemble a volcanic stone, really the volcanic rock that has been so influential to us as a practice. So Monticelli Press and our great graphic design team at Over Under, which is Mark Pasnick and Chris Grimley, set the cover in a gray textured relief to look like a stone, like a rock. Before the text, the book really begins with a meditation on that stone itself, which we found underneath the ground in our first project in northern Rwanda on the border of Uganda and the DRC. Here is the refined handcrafted masonry joinery of one of the more recent projects, a doctor's housing project, which skill set and calibration is incredibly stunning. Here is a few years prior to that, our first stone wall attempt, where you can see the gaps between the stones are a little bit larger, but the wall is much grander. And locally, these stones are often pulled from the ground and used as walls with incredibly visually stunning graphic resolutions, really revealing the mortar joints and providing some sort of visual relief and kind of stunning communicating device in the local sort of garden walls and house walls, or even the kind of playful polka dot vocabulary between void and relief. And these stones often are pulled from the ground to make way for tillable soil left in piles, sometimes for free, on the side of the road. The stones are light, they're airy and porous and quite beautiful. And these garden walls line the countryside and really define the landscape of this mountainous region, its boundaries and its potentials. So for us, the stone is a powerful symbol of place. It's a measure of what is discarded and can be reused to configure beauty. It's a signal to the hands that must and still mold the built world that we are reliant on, and the skill that changes over time by the intervention and collaboration of design. But it was also a sort of punctum for the philosophical discovery we encountered in this work, and the book's second, I would say, hidden title, Or and Is. or "and is" was tentatively the title of the book, but we decided to couch it within the broader binary that this book and I think this work refers to, namely the journey between the binaries of justice or beauty. To move from justice or beauty is to believe that justice and beauty is possible, a kind of hope in our work as designers, and ultimately to the conclusion that that hunt itself, that search is the search for justice is beauty. When we went to work with the healthcare group called Partners in Health in Northern Rwanda in 2008, many assumed that architecture of great social value was not actually good architecture. We've heard that before. We began really confronted with the idea that we had a difficult choice to make between justice or beauty. That there was a sort of unstated binary between the two, or a choice to be made in our profession between working on projects of social, environmental, and economic justice, or working on an architecture and its search for beauty and meaning. The great Italian architect, Giancarlo De Carlo, often from Venice, presaged this critique in the late 70s by calling it the false dichotomy between the two, between valuing beauty in our profession or valuing social meaning. He called it the bread and roses dilemma that Ernesto Rogers at Casabella magazine sort of prompted him by in the mid 50s and 60s. So what we set out to do is take De Carlo's challenge that both are possible, the functioning of an essential service facility designed in this case to reduce infectious airborne diseases like tuberculosis and now COVID, and the craftsmanship, form-making, and care of an architecture that considered both its place in time and relevance and space. This is the justice and beauty proposition. And it was in the stone that we learned this lesson, I would say. A doctor had come to me early on while we were working on the project and he told me that the project was a giant waste of time, an unnecessary expense to bring architecture in, keeping value and drugs and essential medicines from dying patients. But after we finished the project and started seeing patients, he confronted me at an event and he apologized to me. He told me he was wrong. He said that when he saw the stone walls, he was persuaded that the construction of dignity was at the core of medical practice, and that without it, they were not fully serving the whole person. From this, I really learned that the search for beauty is also that search for justice, that these two are not binaries or inseparable, that beauty in and of itself is a rewriting of injustice and historic wrongs. And so to commit to anything less is itself a form of indignity, a form of injustice itself. These first principles we learned on this hill, in this first project, on this wall, in this stone, and it became the foundation of this book. The second theme is about how we practice and a configuration as a nonprofit organization. When we often tell other architects that we're a nonprofit, they often joke and they say, hey, so are we, we're also a nonprofit, which of course is a kind of poke at the very little amount of money we get paid as a profession, the very little value we demand as a practice, and how disempowered we've become as a professional body. But it's also a dig at our business model, which I think we can face it isn't working that well. My business partner, Alan Ricks, and one of the co-founders of our group, penned this essay to explain the confusion over how to practice in an unsustainable and unstable business environment, why being intentionally nonprofit has been both a burden and a blessing, and how we have changed our relationship to it over time, even to our name and its various meanings, to be intentionally about what we work, what we charge, what work we give away, and how we evaluate and calculate a practice that is not owned by anyone, but instead works to serve and support staff, break into marketplaces which are inherently suspicious of the value of design professionals. And in the end, our model has kind of convinced us that we're not undercutting a market, but actually carving out new space for the relevance and argument that design is an essential service necessary for the broader functioning of our social order. Third, we've structured the book around a challenge of authorship and voice, describing projects and their evolution through a conversation model, including the key players, stakeholders, clients, and project team. So we tell the story through dialogue with the players that were part of the origin story and have lived there ever since. Carrying forward, this is the Batara Hospital and its evolution over time. which is over 10 years turned into about a half a dozen projects on the same hill and kind of continued to grow and continue to evolve. It's changed this small village, which did not have any electricity in 2007, into a kind of center of education and healthcare in East Africa, with a new university opening across the valley last year. Additional projects emerged that soon took on other medical questions, not just how do we reduce airborne disease like tuberculosis, but how do we prove that key pieces of infrastructure can address other health inequities, in this case, maternal mortality rates, which are some of the highest in the world in Malawi. And this project carries forward with that ambition. Or addressing the outbreak of cholera in Haiti, for example, in 2012, and the need to rethink infrastructure and how it's funded globally, especially after emergency.
Michael, you are at time.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just say we ended the book with our work in Montgomery, Alabama, and how healing can be thought of not just at the body level, but at the level of the nation to address historic traumas and inequities. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you. And if anyone has a chance to see that monument in Montgomery, Alabama, it is deeply worth the trip. Thank you, Michael, and sorry to have to cut you off. But that allows us to share the mic over with Nina. And Nina, I think you want to share your screen.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to address the Biennale question of how we live together by looking at us as a species and see how we failed our planet. As architects and designers, despite our efforts to build sustainably, we haven't made change happen fast enough. And so in the book, it looks to understand why it is that we failed. Financial and ethical reasons alone are not enough to motivate people to invest in ecological design and architecture. And so the book turns to investigating, and the building of the house, turns to investigating the notion of affect. So this interpretation is based on the philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who writes that the mind and the senses work together in one moment of perception and that they are intermingled. And so what we're trying to do is to create architecture and design that simultaneously stimulates the senses and the mind so that we can create spaces that are captivating and incentivize people to invest in environmental design and architecture. So lately, a lot of scientific data has actually confirmed the notion that our synesthetic perception is actually very intermingled with our mind. And so that if we are able to create spaces that highlight the environment and our central perception of the environment through multiple senses, our minds are stimulated in the same way so that we connect to nature, both with our mind and senses in a way that is affective and captivating. So the Gold LEED certified residence is a pilot project that attempts to explore the way that effective environmental technologies can serve affective and captivating design that lifts our spirits. It does this revolving around three themes. The first is its relation to the site. The second is the curve, and the third is the incorporation of environmental technologies from the inception of the design. So in other words, instead of, for example, the photovoltaic panels being added onto the house as an afterthought, the panels are incorporated into the design of the house from its inception. So this house is demonstrating an approach to environmental design to investigate this notion of effect serving affect, where the quantitative elements that will give us lead points will also serve affective experience, so that the well-being of the planet and the well-being of human beings is synchronized. So the site plan here is showing an approach to the site, which is based on Norwegian architectural traditions. I received my PhD from there, where basically the house is modest in scale. Its footprint is determined by the setback to the neighbors and the radius from the wetland, as opposed to many of the neighbors who don't pay respect and build houses in the flood zones. This house pays respect to existing trees and landscape, and it's also based on the idea that it is relating to local architectural typologies, paying respect to vernacular traditions. And again, my interpretation of affect, in the sense that it's stimulating both mind and sense, is that cultural memory is a very key element to affect. And it's not going to be enough to stimulate just the senses. Many architects who design sustainably, do sensually pleasing designs, I think it's important to pay respect to culture and memory. And here you can also see the way that we gain lead points by incorporating permeable surfaces, such as the gravel driveway, the native planting, the beach grass, and then, local traditions enabled this double curved surfacing of the facade with local cedar shingles, which is a hundreds of years old tradition of building in Long Island. So the second idea that this house revolves around is the notion of this curve, which is, the initial sketch was the concept of how we can abide by basic passive house principles, where one side of the house facing south to collect solar heat gain is transparent, and the other side of the house, which is facing north, collects thermal mass. So this translated to the idea of opacity versus transparency, and visually translated to a curved, opaque, super thick northern wall and a crystalline, transparent southern wall. So the entire house is based on this concept sketch section, which in turn is based on very simple passive house principles of environmental design. So the house will take in light from the south, as you can see through this window. And the fact that the wall is curved, it functions as a projection screen. It's white on the inside, but it's the fact that it's curved will abstract the play of shadows coming in through the south, and we'll see more of that in a minute. This very simple weather diagram orients us to the north. The prevailing breeze is super important because the sliding doors let in the breeze for natural passive cooling, and the orientation is super important for the bedrooms facing east for circadian rhythms. And now getting to the environmental technologies that are incorporated into the design of the house. The cistern here is the first example where it's a water collecting element, rainwater, 50% of it is collected here and filtered to irrigate the garden. But at the same time, it functions as a reflecting pool, which is used by many architects such as Richard Neutra. And here the boundary between inside and outside is softened by the reflections that are on the glass and then also on the horizontal surface of the pool. So again, the lead points are gained, but also the architectural design is served by the environmental technology. And here we have a picture of the skylights, which they're meant to be photovoltaic. They're glass at the moment, but they're waiting to be installed, which collect solar power, but at the same time create moving colored patches of geometric light down the walls, which highlight the movement of the sun and the solar clock, so that by living in this house, one becomes more aware of solar rhythms and slower biological pace that enhances well-being.
Nina, take us through quickly.
Oh, am I running out of time? Okay. So yeah, so basically the color range goes from zenith color of the sun to more restful sunset color near the bedrooms. And so the experience of moving down the corridor sort of replicates the movement of the sun throughout the day based on William Turner's paintings and Goethe's color theory, so that the PV technology also speaks to the experience of color theory within the space. These laminated timber trusses are also another environmental technology that was really hard to find a truss company that would achieve this radius. And then the lead materials, which are all from 500 miles distance. The cool marble on the feet is from Vermont, and the mechanical system has also been a super important element of this house, so that the thermal design of the thermal environment, where the climate is particularly wet and hot and humid, so that the thickness of the wall really insulates the building so well, so that we have a tiny, tiny mechanical system. Again, the passive house aim for mechanical systems is to have a mechanical system the size of a hairdryer. So that was, and then we incorporate photovoltaic technology in the interiors of the spaces with a solar lounger that lights up at night, and these outdoor lamps, as well as solar chandeliers, one which creates a sort of candlelight intimate atmosphere around the dining, and one which creates a more moonlight light temperature, which relates to the moon and the sky, and environmental materials and organic materials for all the furnishings designed in the house as well, including local algae. And then I'll end on this image, which is basically the idea that the water from the cistern is reflecting on the inside of the curve. And some people have said that they feel that they are inside an ocean wave in this house, which is, nearby the ocean. Yeah, I'll end on that. Thank you.
That was transporting. Thank you. That is just gorgeous. And my job is to keep us moving. So I'm happy to turn the floor over to Paul.
All right. Just to be respectful of time, I'm a runner, so I do my timed runs. In fact, I've been jogging near Nina's house. So I've seen that. I'm in Southampton here. So I'm going to do, 8 minutes. Here we go. All right. So basically, here I am as an artist, writer, musician, and composer. And one of the things that you guys might be asking yourself, what's a composer doing in the middle of a group of architects? So let me break it down. I'm going to show some slides in a moment. But basically, one of my major themes for my book that I'm working on, I generally publish at MIT about art and technology. But this time around, I'm publishing with Duke University Press. In fact, I'm working on the book now. But essentially, I've been thinking quite a bit about the way that architecture, and going to the theme of the idea of how will we live together better. Obviously, it seems like the world is on fire at this point. We're in the middle of climate change crisis. We're also, everything from Israel, which is heartbreaking to see, in Gaza, to many of the other issues that linger over the American discourse about race, policing, you name it. The legacy of both the crisis and climate mixed with this notion of social inequity are going to be lingering over the global discourse for quite some time to come. In fact, one could argue will probably be deepening. So on a lighter note, to kind of dig into some of the issues that I think are resonant with the topic at hand, I just wanted to kind of riff with you guys about the book. I'm going to share the slides, but I felt like it'd be nice to do a little bit of an oratorical intervention for a second, then show some of the slides. All right, so I want you all to kind of just use your imagination here and go to the middle of World War II, or slightly at the beginning. One of my favorite philosophers is a gentleman by the name of Jean-Paul Sartre. He's a big influence on the book that I'm writing right now. He was a weather systems analyst during World War II at the very beginning of the war. There was a lot of tension between the Germans and the French, as always there is. And basically, they've been involved with a situation called the Sitzkrieg. Many of us know the term Blitzkrieg, which is essentially meaning the speed war, the lightning war. But the Sitzkrieg was a fake war. And the French term is droit de guerre, which is, if anyone out there speaks French, is a situation where you're doing this kind of notion of a simulation of warfare, which then evolved into other issues when the Germans marched through and did all sorts of other issues, bypassing what you call the Maginot Line. Essentially, for me at least, the issue at hand is always thinking about the notion that technology is a tool set that reflects its era. One could argue the legacy of the 20th century has been kind of this sort of dematerialization of many of the issues that many of the architects have been talking about today. And I've been fascinated with this idea of giving people better tools for critical thinking. And as I think Julia mentioned, how can we look to the past to help us rethink the future? So Jean-Paul Sartre, World War II. You have to kind of go back a little earlier. And there was a gentleman by the name of Musa al-Khwarizmi. He's generally considered to be one of the mathematicians who coined the term algorithm. In fact, the term algorithm is taken from his name, al-Khwarizmi. The Europeans couldn't pronounce it right. And essentially, the term algorithm became a foundation for much of Muslim mathematics, and even the ideas of later on Fibonacci. If you're into mathematics, there's this thing called the Fibonacci Sequence in Italy. In fact, the number 0 was banned by the Pope for a long time because they felt it was the number of the devil, and there was all sorts of stuff going on. But essentially, when you start to think about mathematics and the idea of social space, we live in an era where we now have sort of lit on fire most of the notions of the previous eras of social space. So the Maginot Line became a sort of a fascination for another philosopher that influences the book, Paul Virilio. Now, the term information architecture was coined by Richard Saul Wurman, which maybe you might remember his gentleman who was one of the early founders of the TED conference. And him and some of your team, they parted ways, and you guys were able to rock and roll. So it's always been a pleasure to see how that notion of information architecture kind of lingers over the global discourse, because we're really rethinking social space as we move it further and further into a networked world. So when Sartre was writing at the end of World War II, he came up with the term être et néant, being and nothingness. And what's fascinating about that kind of relationship is not only his relationship to jazz. He was a huge fan of Miles Davis. He would go see Miles Davis's shows and be writing philosophical treatises in the middle of a jazz club. But once the Cold War kicked in after the World War II, one of the things that lingered over it was computational discourse. And the war of World War II, one could argue, was an information war far more than a physical war. And the reason I'm linking my book to that is that Bunker Archaeology, which is a classic that Paul Virilio wrote, thought about physical space and dematerialization as we move into a further and further accelerated frame of reference. Now, World War II, one could argue, set the tone for things like this. This is his book, Bunker Archaeology. And I'm going to fast forward to a couple of years later. We have a very renowned collaboration between John Cage and Sunra, both composers who highly inspired an entire generation of people to rethink the notion of silence. John Cage was the first composer to write for turntables. In 1939, he wrote a book called Imaginary Landscape. You went into an exhibition and there was record players skipping on frequencies. And he said, the future will be these landscapes made of frequencies. So here we are in an era of Wi-Fi. Here we are in an era of satellite distributed network systems. Here we are in a notion of the networked self. So the book that I'm working on is called Digital Fictions, The Future of Storytelling. And I'm fascinated with how this notion of the quantified self, how we think about the reign of numbers over us, how we think about these notions of how art and science and technology have taken these Cold War and space age tools. Say, for example, the Van Allen belt. Here we are, 1969. If you start to think about the Van Allen belt as a kind of magnetic sphere around the planet, you can easily see that human beings have always messed up. I'll give you a funny example. When they discovered the Van Allen belt, the first thing they decided to do was send a nuclear bomb to it. It was called Operation Starfish Prime. Now, a couple of years fast forward later, that was called the space race. Here we are in the information war era. ARPANET was the foundation of the internet. 1969 to 2019, the 50th anniversary, I was commissioned to do a symphony, actually, which I spoke about on the TED conference, by the way, Chi. It's a fun conference piece. But the basic celebration of 50 years of what the internet had done to society, if you start to think about 2021 and we're watching bombs fall with the Iron Dome in Israel, you can easily see that war and information have kind of still become the founding crucible of our information era. So what I'm doing for my book is kind of curating a series of conversations and dialogues between science fiction writers, artists, architects, people like Kim Stanley Robinson, legendary writers like William Gibson, and so on and so on. It's an anthology, or what I like to call a mega mix. So the composition that this generated was called Quantopia, Quantified Utopia. So as a composer in the middle of architects, I do want to just always say it's a homage to the idea of pattern recognition in structure. And if you think about music, music is nothing but patterns. And there's a very famous poet, Goethe, who said, architecture is nothing but frozen music. So what I'm doing is reverse engineering what you guys are doing today and thinking about music as nothing but liquid architecture. So if we kind of fast forward to 2021, and from this 1969 image of the internet, you can see this notion of logarithmic or algorithmic, or for that matter, exponential growth. The internet now is billions and billions of nodes. The first 2 nodes were done in October 1969, and by December, there were 4, which you're seeing here. And you continue that exponential growth, and then you have your cell phone, you have every other device around you, and then how do we tell stories with that? All right, so my run has been done here. We had a sprint there. And so I kind of could go in many directions. The idea is it's a multivalent narrative, and the book is still in progress. I'm writing furiously, trying to finish it. So with that said and done, I just want to end with a caveat saying that the challenge of authorship in this era of networked identity is going to have to be a reflection of how everything from algorithms, computational narratives, and above all, even if you look at the last election in 2016, you can easily see stuff like computational propaganda with Cambridge Analytica and so on. Those things shape and sculpt every aspect of modern life, the stories that we tell ourselves. So the idea is, how do we remix that? So just want to say thanks to everybody to having me. And I have gone over by 15 seconds. All right.
Amazing. Paul, if you run as fast as you think, I mean, I think we're all in trouble because we have a marathon winner in our midst. That was really stunning. And it brings us to our last set of speakers. And I'm really happy to welcome Mitch, Maria, and Nurham. And Mitch and I have been in touch about this project for, probably 2 years. So I want to give him credit and thanks, and the team at Terraform One for putting this together and bringing us all together. So I turn the mic over to the 3 of you.
Thanks, Chi. Thanks, Paul, and all of my fellow authors, the other 7 of you. Absolutely love your books. Always have loved your work. Always will. You're certainly friends and colleagues. And when this is all done, as Chi and I were talking about, we must meet together either in Venice or some bar in New York and celebrate these amazing achievements. And it has been quite a year or so to get this done. So let me start by sharing my screen, because there's some things here that we should take a look at. But Terraform's been involved as a nonprofit for some time, thinking about the near future of our cities and to make them socio-ecological. And there's a lot of people involved. Maria and Nurhan are here today, and Vivian and Melanie and our board of directors have all been very supportive of helping Terraform think about the ecological future of our cities. This book on ACTAR, and thank you, by the way, to the ECC for helping with this in Venice. You guys are amazing. So giant love beams to the ECC. But ACTAR has been supporting us for a number of books. This is our second one with them, and this represents hundreds of people that have worked for us for now 15 years, researching and designing and thinking about this kind of single overriding predicate that we call our mission statement, which is design against extinction. So every moment on this planet, I think every 9 minutes, we lose another creature. That's another insect, another mammal, another bird, another fish, gone forever. And we're all complicit, and we can do something about it. Certainly in the fields of architecture, urban planning, real estate development, we have ways of thinking about greening our cities, such as this one is transforming 42nd Street in a speculative way into something that's super ecological. and also using different types of materials that are novel, that haven't been tried in architecture. So we do a lot of biotech. This is my daughter, my older daughter, Mia, on a chair that you can eat. So she goes into kindergarten, tells her fellow kids, hey, daddy grows chairs that are edible, just like our crayons and our glue. And that's a different way of thinking about chairs, because many of them that we purchase from IKEA end up in a landfill. This is a chair that we designed that is 100% compostable. It's made of mycelium, or the root base of mushrooms. It's grafted to plyboo. And essentially, when you're done with it, it feeds thousands of other forms of life. We also, with TED, have recently designed this for the TED Countdown, which is a concept of producing an egg that contains a rarefied species that's threatened in a local area. Everything inside that egg has the habitat and seed bombs that allow for 7 years of slow decay before the egg essentially melts away, metaphorically, and that creature is released and rewilds the local population. The point is to communicate to the public that we're losing species all the time. This is another creature we work with as a client. This client is a mealworm. It's fun to have a client that's a mealworm. These guys eat styrofoam waste. Waste in cities is a very big problem. We developed a clock system and a public sculpture, or actually an architectural folly, that allows the public to dump their styrofoam waste inside the belly of this digester and watch the mealworms eat styrofoam. Normally takes 500 years for styrofoam to disappear naturally. Instead, with something like mealworms, you can watch it happen in a matter of weeks. This installation was in Camden, New Jersey, and it's a very difficult community there, in a city that needs a lot of attention, especially from architects and urban designers and thinkers like us. Another project we're looking at is called Engineered Living Materials, or ELMs. This is taking grafting inosculate matter to form one contiguous vascular system, or growing homes from living woody plants. This has been a project we've been working on now for close to a decade and a half. These are the reactors that grow ficus into 3 meters of length. And the idea is that we would take these living roots and weave them on a computer scaffold, or CNC scaffold. And that geometry is kind of connected to these grafted, woven living plants, and the entire structure is alive. ELMs, or engineered living materials, we think is the future in architecture. It's not going to be concrete. It's not going to be steel. We need to think of materials that fit into the Earth's metabolism. This is another client of ours. It's a cricket. Why do we use these guys or work with these guys? Well, they're for eating. Everyone eats bugs. You've probably had some bugs today and you didn't know it, but 80% of the planet eats bugs regularly, and we need to do that. The United Nations in around 2013 has said we've got to stop eating cows, pig, chicken, and lamb. It's too much, or at least we need to reduce that footprint and the effect on the climate. So this is a cricket shelter and farm. Each one of these bio units, roughly 320 of them, every 7 weeks, grows or harvests or produce crickets. We feed them apple cores and lime rinds. These crickets then die naturally. We don't stab individual crickets. We allow them to die of old age when they're fat and happy. And then they're harvested and they're milled into a flour. That flour is then used to make bagels, bonbons, pasta, whatever you would like. Some of the best pasta I've ever tasted wasn't in Venice, was actually from a chef who worked with cricket flour. So these are our cricket sex pods to encourage them to reproduce over the shelter. It was certainly a fun project. And the last 2 projects here is a farm pod. This essentially looks at growing food inside an urban area. So you can go directly from pasture to plate inside this bit of technology. And then the last 2 projects here is called the Monarch Sanctuary. The monarch is a beautiful butterfly. It's disappearing. They are native to New York. We designed a building where we're integrating the feeders, their perch points, areas where they sleep, areas where they rest, so that we can give this creature a sanctuary and a fighting chance, a place of refuge built into the double skin facade system, so that we don't lose this monarch. And this was installed, this 4-ton engineered object was installed at the Cooper Hewitt to show how monarchs can stay alive. And then Nurhan's going to talk about this project.
So, the question is, how do you live in the future of explosive population growth? And the first thing to do, I think, is obviously to map it. So what you're looking at here is a map of Istanbul on a petri dish using E. coli bacteria. Mapping this E. coli bacteria using a stencil drawing made by hand with two different types of techniques. The one on the right is a grid. The one on the left is a regional map. And this was done using the Buckminster-Fuller's Dymaxion map and stencil patterns to get an understanding of how the population growth happens. To understand this is to basically understand how we live together, particularly when resources are scarce and we need better understanding of housing, water supply, and food. And this is a parametric model of data points using styrene that has been hydroformed over the world of the unfolded icosahedron. And the highest points are the highest points of density over the 20 cities, the 25 cities that we looked at all over the world, of 11 billion people. And we really need to get an understanding of how we're going to live together while the world is increasingly growing with hyperdensity. Thank you.
I think, Maria, you can say one quick thing.
Thank you. So Design with Life provides answers to the question how we all live together. There has never been a more challenging time to be a designer because we are facing threats that are mostly outside our abilities as design professionals. But despite of all this doom and gloom, I see walking the streets of New York City that people are ready to take their masks off and answer this question, or seize this opportunity and start making more intelligent, compassionate, and empowering decisions. So Design with Life offers a lexicon of solutions that are a unique and powerful commodity gleaned from decades of studying, researching, and experimenting. Since the release of the book in late 2019, our readers, mostly students and young professionals, have grappled how to respond to these ideas. This is what we want to continue to explore. Let's run more experiments. Let's test more assumptions, and finally, let's chart a better path forward. Now is the time to apply our creative skills as designers and solve these tough problems. We have to encourage radical collaboration. We need to join forces, all of us, and figure out how to build a better post-COVID world. Thank you, and back to you, Chi.
Bravo. Brava, bravo. Okay, we are past time. We learned so much in this 80 minutes in 8 books. And I hope it really inspires all of you to go and take a deeper look at the book. Each of you have inspired me. I've taken a lot of notes. If we had time, I would be getting right in there with you guys and asking you a lot of questions. I hope we can continue this conversation. Mitch, it was inspired of you to pull this together. We are it's still quite early in the morning in New York, but I think we are all due a nice spritz after this marathon. And yes, please let us all come together and let us all think deeply about this, how we will, and as Julia says, how we must live together. I'm thinking about this every day, and as I said at the top, it's going to be about leadership, and each of you has taken on that job in the way that you present the issue and think about it and act on your beliefs and your mission. So, thank you, everyone. Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon in Venice.
Yes. Absolutely.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.